I am looking at maritime tracking data that has been circulating among shipping insurance analysts and naval intelligence circles since approximately 0300 hours GMT this morning. What it shows is not a single vessel seizure. It is not two. It is not an isolated Houthi drone strike that the American media can categorize and dismiss. What it shows is 14 commercial cargo vessels, 14 brought to a halt, boarded or rerouted within a single 24-hour window across a stretch of international shipping lane that carries approximately 12% of global trade annually. 14 vessels. 24 hours. That is not a militia. That is a coordinated naval doctrine being executed with precision. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this is happening now and not 3 months ago, why the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet response has been structurally inadequate from the first hour, and why the economic consequences of what you are watching unfold will reach your household, your fuel costs, and your supply chain within 72 hours, whether or not your government tells you it will. Subscribe now if you have not already, because this level of analysis is not appearing in your mainstream news cycle, and the gap between what is being reported and what is actually happening is growing wider by the hour. Let us begin with geography, because geography is destiny in this theater, and most of the analysis being offered on Western television this morning is being conducted by people who have never looked at a nautical map of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait with serious attention. The Bab el-Mandeb, which translates from Arabic as the Gate of Grief, and that translation deserves your attention, is a choke point approximately 29 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, situated between the Horn of Africa to the west and the Yemeni coastline to the east. To put that in perspective, the English Channel at its narrowest is approximately 33 kilometers. The world's most heavily patrolled stretch of water in European naval history is barely wider than the choke point now in active dispute. Through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea corridor it anchors passes approximately 17,000 commercial vessels per year under normal conditions. According to the International Maritime Organization, that figure represents roughly 30% of all global container shipping and an even higher percentage of European-bound Asian manufactured goods. Now here is what the mainstream coverage is failing to contextualize. The Houthi campaign, which has been ongoing since late 2023 and which Western media consistently frames as a nuisance operation by an Iranian proxy, has already reduced Red Sea commercial traffic by an estimated 40% from its pre-conflict baseline. 40% reduction before today. Lloyd's of London has documented war risk insurance premiums for Red Sea transits rising by over 900% since the campaign began. 900%. And the ships that have been paying those premiums have been rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding between 10 and 14 days to transit times and between $800,000 and $2 million in fuel and operational costs per voyage. That is the baseline into which today's 14-vessel seizure event has just landed. At approximately 1400 hours Eastern Time, Pentagon spokesperson Major General Patricia Hughes described today's seizures as, and I am citing the official transcript directly, an escalation by Iranian-backed Houthi forces consistent with ongoing destabilization activity. That framing is deliberate and it is misleading. What the framing does is attribute the operation to the Houthis, to a non-state actor, to a militia, to what American media has spent 18 months calling Iranian proxies, in a way that keeps Iran itself at one additional degree of remove from direct responsibility. It is a framing designed to create diplomatic space. And it is failing, because the operational signatures of today's seizures do not match Houthi militia capability profiles from any point in the previous 2 years of this campaign. According to reporting in Jane's Defense Weekly, and confirmed independently by 2 senior maritime security analysts at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, the 14 vessels seized today were not targeted randomly. They were targeted by flag state. 11 of the 14 vessels seized are registered under flags of nations that either voted in favor of the most recent United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Iranian nuclear enrichment activities, or have active bilateral defense agreements with the United States. That is not a militia conducting harassment operations. That is a state actor executing a sanctions-equivalent policy through maritime interdiction, with target selection logic that requires intelligence infrastructure, diplomatic monitoring capability, and command authority that no Houthi unit in the Yemeni highlands has independently possessed at any point in this conflict. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Naval Command, the IRGC, has been documented by both American and British naval intelligence as having embedded advisory personnel within Houthi maritime operations since at least 2021. But what we are seeing today represents a qualitative shift from advisory presence to direct operational integration. The coordination speed, the simultaneous targeting across multiple maritime zones, and the flag state selection logic all point to a single command authority making decisions in real time. Received, that is announcement number one. Announcement number two. The legal architecture Iran is using to justify these seizures is more sophisticated than it is being reported, and that sophistication matters enormously for what comes next. Stay with me here because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for international maritime law and American strategic options become genuinely difficult. Iran is not claiming these seizures as acts of war. It is not claiming them as piracy. The official statement released through Iranian state media IRNA at 11:17 hours Tehran time describes the operation as, and this is a direct citation from the official translation, a defensive maritime inspection protocol enacted in response to ongoing economic warfare conducted against the Islamic Republic and its allies through unilateral sanctions and blockade-equivalent commercial restrictions. Parse that language carefully. Defensive inspection protocol. Response to economic warfare. That framing is not accidental. It mirrors almost precisely the legal argumentation that the United States itself has used to justify naval interdiction operations in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Caribbean against vessels suspected of sanctions violations. The International Court of Justice precedent that Iran's legal team is almost certainly referencing is the 1986 Nicaragua v. United States ruling, in which the IJ held that economic coercion constituting interference with a state's sovereign rights can, under defined conditions, trigger a right of self-defense under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Iran has been building toward this legal argument for 3 years. The seizures today are the operational expression of a legal position that Tehran has been constructing in international forums with meticulous care, and Western governments are going to find that unraveling it is significantly more complicated than the current media coverage suggests. Here is the second dimension of announcement number 2. 14 vessels seized in 24 hours produces a specific economic signal in global commodity markets with a speed that is almost impossible to counter through diplomatic channels. Crude oil futures on the ICE Brent exchange moved $4.70 per barrel within the first 6 hours of the operation becoming public. That is not speculation. That is physical market participants recalibrating supply chain risk in real time. The Bloomberg Commodity Desk reported this morning that shipping futures for Suez alternative Cape of Good Hope routing have already spiked to their highest levels since the initial Houthi campaign began 18 months ago. What Iran has demonstrated today is that it does not need to fire a single missile at an American carrier battle group to generate immediate, measurable global economic pressure. It needs to move 14 ships. Received, that is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that almost nobody in the mainstream analysis community is connecting correctly. The timing of this operation relative to the ongoing Geneva negotiations is not coincidental. It is the negotiation. The United States, the European Union, and Iran have been engaged in what diplomatic sources have described to Reuters as technical level talks regarding a revised nuclear framework since late last quarter. Those talks have been progressing slowly, with the primary sticking point being American insistence on Iranian cessation of uranium enrichment above 60% purity as a precondition for any sanctions relief. Iran has refused that precondition consistently, but here is what has changed in the past 3 weeks. According to reporting by the Financial Times, on June 1st, 2026, 3 days ago, the Biden-era sanctions relief framework that had allowed limited Iranian oil export revenues to flow through a controlled escrow mechanism was formally suspended by executive order. That suspension, which the current administration described as a pressure tool to accelerate Iranian compliance on enrichment, has instead produced precisely the counter-escalation that multiple European diplomatic sources warned it would produce. Iran's calculation, visible now in hindsight with uncomfortable clarity, was this. If the United States can impose economic pressure through financial mechanisms that effectively constitute a blockade, then Iran can impose economic counterpressure through maritime mechanisms that constitute the same thing in reverse. You cannot argue that one is legitimate and the other is aggression without the legal argument destroying itself. And Iran knows this. And more importantly, China and Russia know it, and both Beijing and Moscow are currently refusing to condemn today's operation in any United Nations Security Council emergency session context, which means any resolution demanding Iranian withdrawal from seized vessels will face a double veto. Received, that is announcement number 3. Now let us talk about what the mainstream media is not covering, because there are 2 stories unfolding simultaneously, and American cable news has access to only one of them. The story being covered is the military operational story. How many ships? Which flags? What is the Fifth Fleet response? Will American warships escort cargo traffic? Can the United States Navy re-establish freedom of navigation in the Red Sea corridor by force if necessary? This is the story that fills the 24-hour news cycle because it has visible, photographable, describable elements. Ship silhouettes, naval formations, press briefings with maps. The story not being covered, the story that actually determines how this ends, is the domestic political economy story inside 3 capitals simultaneously. In Washington, the administration is facing a midterm election cycle in which fuel prices are a primary voter concern, and a Red Sea closure that pushes gasoline prices above $5 nationally is an electoral crisis that no amount of carrier battle group theater can resolve. In Beijing, Chinese import-export data for the first quarter of 2026 already shows contraction in European-bound manufactured goods exports attributable to Red Sea rerouting costs. China has more than one reason to allow this crisis to continue at exactly the current temperature, high enough to impose costs on Western-aligned economies, not hot enough to trigger a direct American military response that would close the strait entirely and damage Chinese energy imports from the Gulf. And in Tehran, the Revolutionary Guard Naval Command has just demonstrated in front of a global audience that it has developed operational capability that it did not possess 18 months ago, capability that changes the cost-benefit calculation for any military action against Iranian nuclear facilities by an order of magnitude. Trump responded to this morning's seizures with a statement describing Iran as, and I am quoting the official White House social media post, an outlaw regime that will face consequences. This has not notably changed the insurance premium on Red Sea shipping. The markets are more honest than the press releases. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States announces consequences, and the consequence it announces is a phrase on a social media platform, while 14 cargo ships remain in Iranian-aligned custody, that is not ambiguity. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is a capability gap made visible in real time, and every adversary and every ally watching the situation is cataloging it. Consider the Peloponnesian War. 2 great powers, Athens and Sparta, went to war over regional dominance, over trade routes, over alliance obligations and strategic positioning that each believed it could not afford to concede. They fought for 27 years. Both sides bled. Both sides exhausted their treasuries, their manpower, their political cohesion. And who won? Macedon, Philip of Macedon, whose kingdom had been a peripheral power at the start of the conflict, watched the 2 dominant Greek powers destroy each other and then walked into a power vacuum that neither Athenian democracy nor Spartan military discipline had the remaining strength to contest. The United States is Athens in this parallel. Iran is not Sparta, Iran is the force at the choke point. China is Macedon. Every month this crisis continues at its current temperature is a month in which Chinese diplomatic capital in the global south increases, Chinese alternative payment infrastructure expands, and the dollar-denominated trade architecture that underpins American financial power erodes by one more increment that individually seems small and cumulatively is not. Path 1, negotiated de-escalation within 60 days. This requires the United States to offer Iran a credible sanctions relief package that includes partial unfreezing of the escrow mechanism suspended 3 weeks ago, and it requires Iran to release the seized vessels and return to a formal maritime standstill agreement. The conditions for this path exist. European mediators France, Germany, and Italy specifically are actively working this channel according to diplomatic reporting from Le Monde and Der Spiegel published in the past 48 hours. This path is possible. Its probability depends almost entirely on whether the American administration can accept the domestic political optics of offering Iran concessions in the immediate aftermath of a seizure operation, which is genuinely difficult. Path 2, controlled military escalation. The United States Navy convoys commercial shipping through the Red Sea corridor under active naval escort. Iranian-aligned forces engage the convoy escorts, and the conflict expands into a limited naval engagement. This path leads to oil price spikes of between $20 and $40 per barrel within 72 hours of the first kinetic exchange, a global recession probability that the International Monetary Fund would assess at 40% or higher within a quarter, and a domestic American political crisis that would dwarf the fuel price concerns of the current election cycle. This is the path that military planners in the Pentagon most fear and that American political leadership most consistently refuses to prepare the public for honestly. Path 3. Prolonged strategic ambiguity. The situation continues at its current temperature. Some vessels are released through quiet diplomatic back channels. Some remain in custody as negotiating leverage. Commercial shipping continues to reroute around Africa. Insurance premiums remain elevated. The dollar cost of the crisis accumulates invisibly in the form of embedded freight costs and consumer goods prices, rising slowly enough that no single news cycle captures it as a crisis, but fast enough that it shaves measurable points off economic growth in every Western-aligned economy over the next 2 to 4 quarters. This is the path that Iran's strategic planning most clearly anticipates and most carefully designed today's operation to enable. I think we are closer to Path 3 than either of the others, and I think Path 3 is more dangerous than Path 2 because it is slow enough to be normalized and important enough that normalization is a strategic catastrophe. Here are the questions I want you to carry away from this analysis. Why did Iran choose this week and not last month? And what does the specific timing relative to the Geneva technical talks tell you about Tehran's strategic patience? Why are 11 of the 14 seized vessels' flag registered to nations with active U.S. defense agreements? And what does that selection logic tell you about the intelligence infrastructure Iran has built? And what does the absence of any Security Council condemnation, any from China or Russia, tell you about the degree to which this operation was coordinated, previewed, or simply permitted by the two powers whose veto makes any UN response structurally impossible? Tell me in the comments what you think the administration does next. Tell me whether you believe Path 1, Path 2, or Path 3 is where this goes. I want to know what angle you think is being most underreported in the coverage you have been seeing, because I guarantee you it is one of the 3 threads I laid out in announcements 1, 2, and 3. We will keep tracking every development in the Red Sea, in Tehran, in Beijing, and in Geneva. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is happening to global trade and why it is going to show up in their lives, whether they are following the news or not. Save this video, come back and check the predictions, turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis. Let me take you deeper into one dimension of this story that I have not yet fully addressed, because it is the dimension that will determine whether today's seizure event becomes a contained diplomatic crisis or an inflection point in the history of global maritime commerce. The insurance architecture of global shipping is not well understood outside specialist circles, but it is the mechanism through which geopolitical risk translates most rapidly and most concretely into consumer prices. The protection and indemnity clubs, the P&I clubs, that collectively insure approximately 90% of the world's ocean-going commercial tonnage, are London-based mutual insurance organizations that have been the backbone of global shipping risk management since the mid-19th century. When those organizations declare a geographic area a war risk zone, the premium consequences are immediate, automatic, and compounding. The Lloyd's Joint War Committee placed the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and adjacent waters on its war risk list in November 2023. Premium rates for transit of those waters have since been calculated as additions to base hull insurance rates at a multiplier that has ranged between 3.5 and 12 times normal, depending on the specific transit date and the vessel flag state. Following today's 14-vessel seizure, the Lloyd's Joint War Committee met in emergency session at approximately 1600 hours London time. According to sources cited by the Lloyd's List trade publication, the committee is considering an extension of the war risk zone to include a broader swath of the northern Indian Ocean That would, if implemented, capture the most common alternative routing used by vessels attempting to avoid the Red Sea corridor without the full Cape of Good Hope rerouting cost. If the war risk zone extends to the northern Indian Ocean approaches, the cost calculation for global shipping shifts in a way that affects not just the companies operating the vessels, but every supply chain that depends on container shipping for any input or output. The International Chamber of Shipping has estimated that the container shipping cost increases already embedded in global freight rates since the initial Houthi campaign began have added between 0.3 and 0.7 percentage points to consumer inflation in Western Europe and North America. That estimate predates today's seizure. Post-seizure freight futures suggest the embedded inflation impact of the extended disruption period will exceed 1 full percentage point 1% added to consumer prices from shipping costs alone if the current situation persists for more than 60 days. 1% does not sound catastrophic in isolation. Add it to the existing inflation trajectory, add it to the energy price pressure from oil futures moving on Red Sea news, and add it to the supply chain uncertainty premium that manufacturers embed in pricing when they cannot reliably forecast transit times. And the aggregate impact on household costs in importing economies is measurable and substantial.